Okay, it looks like people logging in is sort of slowing down now, so it's probably a good time to get started with this. First, let me welcome everybody to this. Thank you for joining our virtual workshop. I'm Gordon Bonan, a senior scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, along with Mike St. Clements at NEON and a workshop steering committee. We're the people who have been putting this together. And what I want to do, it's been a while since we've last met. It's been over 2 years since we were actually able to get together and talk about these ideas of collaborations between NCAR and NEON. So what I want to do first is give some background of what we're up to, an overview of the workshop, and then some ideas for you to think about during the presentations. I think we have a really good list of speakers this morning talking about various aspects of atmospheric science and ecology and how to foster collaborations between those two disciplines. But as background, we had our first workshop on this in April 2019. NSF had approached NCAR and NEON about the fostering collaborations between the two organizations. That led to this April 2019 workshop with support from Geosciences at NSF and Biological Sciences. We had 48 participants across NCAR, NEON, and universities, and several program managers. And there were three outcomes that really came from that first workshop. This idea of our perspectives manuscript, the NCAR NEON modeling and data exchanges, and a supersite concept. And I'll go through each of these. What we had hoped to do and been planning to do was have a follow-up workshop where we could address these outcomes. That had been planned for April 2020, but we all know how 2020 worked out. And so after 18 months now of not being able to meet in person, we finally realized we just have to continue on and we'll have to do these meetings virtually. It'd be more fun to do it in person, but the virtual workshop will allow us to keep maintaining momentum. And so what we came up with the idea was there were the three outcomes from that first workshop, and we're going to have three workshops over the next several months to address these. Today's workshop is the perspectives manuscript, and that's will be the focus now. Another aspect has been the modeling between NCAR and NEON and data exchanges. We hope we'll be planning to have that workshop again virtually in November, and you're actually going to hear more about that today in one of the presentations. And then the third outcome was the idea of a supersite, this of NCAR and NEON observing systems. Just to remind people of what that concept was, it was like, how can we supplement NEON terrestrial measurements with NCAR observational capabilities, and particularly things like atmospheric chemistry, measurements of the boundary layer, linking the surface processes into the boundary layer. These are capabilities that NCAR has that NCAR could bring to augment what's going on with NEON. We could also address issues like heterogeneity and surface fluxes and scaling from bottom up to top down. So those are some of the ideas of the supersite. We're planning that for April 2020, and maybe it'll be in person, maybe not. I'm not quite sure yet, but this is the schedule we'd like to be on. The NCAR NEON modeling has been a really productive sort of collaboration that came out of the workshop. Danica and Lombardozzi and David Durden from NEON will be talking about that later. But I just want to give one slide on that because I think it's really been a nice example of these collaborations, both with across directorates within NSF, but also across NSF-funded organizations. And in particular, the computer and information science and engineering, biological sciences, and geosciences at NSF have teamed together to fund the collaborations across NCAR, NEON, and also SAIS funds a Center of Excellence for Cyber Infrastructure, the CI Compass project. And these three NSF-supported organizations, we've teamed up together to develop a modeling system that is sort of a portable computational environment to enable scientific discovery and innovation by university researchers. It will further develop and improve NCAR models, and it's also going to enhance NEON measurements and data distribution. And again, this is a collaboration across 3 different directorates at NSF and 3 different organizations supported by NSF. There's a website that NEON is hosting on the activities and where the data from the modeling project will be posted. And you can see that here. This will be talked about later by Dave and Danica. What I want to say also is that we have a workshop steering committee that was formed. Mike St. Clements and I are nominally the co-chairs of this, but we have a broad participation across universities, NEON and NCAR. We actually had 2 new members since the last workshop, Dave Durden from NEON and Danica Lombardozzi from NCAR. They graciously agreed to join, and we immediately tasked them with putting together a presentation for the workshop. So thank you for joining and doing that. Mike St. Clements at NEON is the organizer of this meeting. Thank you, Mike, for doing that. You've done a great job of pulling everything together. And then the other person I want to call out is Adrian Rocha from University of Notre Dame. He is really taking the lead on this perspective manuscript, and he'll be giving a presentation later this morning about his ideas of what that perspective manuscript should be and how we can get organized to prepare that. So thank you, Adrian, for doing that, because I think that's going to be a really important contribution of the series of workshops. And then finally, also, Todd Amadeo from NCAR is providing the administrative support for the workshop. We couldn't have set up the virtual meetings and the working groups and breakout groups without his help. And then NSF support from Geosciences, biological sciences for the workshop in particular, but also Bill Miller with SICE for enabling the modeling activities. So Adrian is going to give us an overview of his ideas, the perspective manuscript. If you looked at the sign-up sheet and the homework, there's sort of 4 working groups, 4 breakout group themes that we've put together that we'll talk about this afternoon. Adrian will give his views on those working groups and what they're going to entail and what he would like to see out of that later. But what I thought I would do in this overview in the introduction is to share my ideas and my experiences with these working groups and looking at the themes that came across. I've experienced all of these themes throughout my 33-year career now at the interface of ecology and atmospheric sciences. And I thought I could actually sort of share my perspectives on those with the idea that you all should be thinking about your own perspectives and how you've experienced these same ideas or issues or even problems or challenges in your career, so we can bring those perspectives into the working group meetings this afternoon. And so the first working group is dealing with, considering the historical context and philosophy of ecology and atmospheric sciences. And something I stumbled into early in my career, almost purely by chance, was this idea of deforesting the world and how deforesting the world was changing climate. In the 1980s, there had been a lot of talk about tropical deforestation. I had written a paper about deforesting the United States and how the deforestation of the United States was could have affected climate. And what I discovered in doing that was I thought I was doing something really novel that hadn't been done before. Everybody was doing tropical deforestation. I was trying to do temperate deforestation. And I discovered slowly that there was this huge historical literature about deforesting the United States and this huge controversy about whether that was changing climate or not. So I sort of stumbled onto it by chance, but it's really a fascinating topic that I think speaks to the challenges of interfacing ecology and atmospheric science. And what you're seeing here is one of the first written accounts of climate change resulting from deforestation. This was early in the Spanish settlement of the Americas, and it is really the first. A lot of effort is people made some interest or some comments about Christopher Columbus and his comments on deforesting America, but this is actually one of the first direct written accounts that was written on it. And what happened is over the next 300 years, this idea of deforesting the planet actually sort of spread, and it spread into India, Australia, New Zealand, Africa. Even in Europe, there was a lot of concern about how historical deforestation had changed the climate of Europe. And so there was almost a 300-year sort of what I would call qualitative discussion, debate, and speculation about climate change arising from deforestation. By the mid 1800s, that qualitative discussion had changed more to quantitative, and you actually started to see the emergence of a science of forest meteorology. This is the work of Antoine Becquerel in France, Ernst Ebermeyer in Germany, Joseph Lorenz in Austria. What they were talking about was sort of an interdisciplinary science that brought together meteorology, forest ecology, plant physiology, hydrology, and soil physics to try to understand how deforestation was changing climate. In their books, they talk about processes that we recognize today in the science of evaporation and transpiration, radiative transfer, biomass heat storage, soil temperature, interception, infiltration, runoff, soil moisture, and many, many more. They were also establishing what they called forest meteorological observatories. This was to measure temperature and humidity and wind, both within the canopy and above the canopy. They were measuring rainfall. They were comparing forest sites with nearby open sites. These are all the methods that we use today. And I would actually say that this is maybe, you could argue that this is a forerunner to the eddy covariance systems that are established today. And they were dealing with scaling issues. They understood that their measurements were at the forest microclimate scale, but they were interested in forest macroclimates, how the large scale deforestation was changing climate. What I would say is we can recognize the roots of our science right here in these books and these words and these ideas that they were talking about. But there was a backlash against the science. And that was because at the time there was much interest and really a widespread effort to conserve forests or even plant trees, reforest the world to promote rainfall. And that generated a backlash among meteorologists, particularly in the US. Here you see Cleveland Abbey, who was a very influential, almost sort of a founder of numerical weather prediction in the US. He's recognized today by the American Meteorological Society in its Distinguished Service Award. And he talked about rational climatology as giving no basis for the influence of forests on climate. Willis Moore, who was the chief of the US Weather Bureau, was even more adamant. He talked about how much has been written about deforestation and climate and rainfall, but little of it has actually been written by meteorologists. So he took a very parochial view of it. If it wasn't written by meteorologists, it didn't have any value. And so this really sort of, in these comments and these others, the science of sort of forest meteorology was dismissed. It became relegated to the study of forest microclimates. And that's what we see today, particularly when we talk about agriculture and forest meteorology. It's mostly associated with the idea of microclimates. And what I would say is that this legacy, this pushback, is really evident and still evident in the science today. It's particularly in this idea of scales from microscale to macro scale. We see this sort of dichotomy, particularly within the atmospheric sciences, of what is more important. Is it sort of fluid dynamics and large scale circulations, or is it local processes? We see this dichotomy between the micro scale and macro scale. And we also see a difference in how we do our sciences. One of the interesting things about Joseph Lorenz from Austria was that in one of his papers or pamphlets, he was actually describing a synergy between forestry and meteorology. He was actually arguing for foresters trained in meteorology and meteorologists trained in forestry. Well, that didn't happen at all. The sciences split and went very narrow and more disciplinary in their focus. So this idea of sort of this interdisciplinary science sort of was dismissed. And I feel like we can still see that evident in our sciences today. So I think there's a really strong legacy and heritage in where we are academically because of this debate. And I find it personally to be really kind of fascinating how we tried to get together, how they tried to form a new science, how it was rejected. And of course, now in the 100 years after the science was rejected, we accept the idea that forests influence climate at the macro scale. You see it in concepts of planting trees, afforestation to mitigate climate change. It's sort of well accepted, but it actually at one point wasn't accepted. Okay, the other working group is looking at sort of how to foster interdisciplinary collaborations. This is working group 2. Again, early in my career, I was involved with a very prominent project called the Boreal Ecosystem Atmosphere Study. It was a project led by Pierce Sellers and Forrest Hall at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. And it really had two ideas, unique ideas it was doing, unique at the time. One was this coupling between ecosystems and the atmosphere, and the other was this issue of scaling. How do you go from process studies at the very local scale to even to the flux tower and to larger scales? It had a lot of promise. I think it actually was very influential. It was very influential in my career. But it actually had some challenges with it. And one of the challenges, the reality of disciplinary science. The idea was to do this interdisciplinary project that brings together people from many different backgrounds. But the way the science was organized was to immediately break up into these disciplinary science groups of airborne fluxes in meteorology, hydrology, remote sensing, terrestrial ecology, tower fluxes, trace gas biogeochemistry. I was involved with both the terrestrial ecology and the airborne fluxes and meteorology working groups. There's a really different tone between these working groups. I would go back and forth between them, how they approached the problem, how they even got organized to talk about approaching the problem was very different between those working groups. There was also another really obvious issue, and that is the idea was that the data would be collected to inform models, but that model data integration didn't necessarily work out. And it didn't work out because the observations funded first, the modeling came second. In fact, what happened was the observationalists had to collect the data, analyze the data, and published it before the modelers were allowed to use the data. And we were also, the modeling was also funded second, not early in the Boreas project. So this idea that we talk about today, that we would like of data informing models and models informing data, that's still a really complex challenge to work with. And I think some of these issues about how observationalists and modelers work together is still apparent today. And we can see it in these ideas of silos or stove. We talk about silos, we talk about stove piping. These issues are still apparent in our science today. The third working group is dealing with this data process friction idea. And again, I'll go back to my Boreas example to explain what I think is really relevant in this, because at that time, the land surface models we were working with were very new and very novel, and we were just trying to show that the models actually can simulate something like the real world. And here's actually some comparisons of model versus observations for sensible heat flux, latent heat flux, net radiation, CO2 flux. And I'd say we were doing a pretty good job. This problem over here of midday depression of transpiration is something that's now recognized as related to midday plant water stress or leaf water stress. We didn't have those in the models at the time, but now we do. But anyways, at that time, not this particular paper, but one of my papers, here's the comments from an anonymous reviewer from one of my earlier works where I was describing the model. And this particular reviewer was talking about modeling photosynthesis and felt comfortable at the level of an individual leaf, but very skeptical about scaling up to whole plants, let alone ecosystem processes. And I would say that this is the challenge we still face today. This particular reviewer was very comfortable at the leaf scale and not at all comfortable at these larger scales. So how do we communicate this idea of process knowledge from the really small scale working up to the large scale? That's one of the challenges we still have today. And the final working group is really focused on this idea of interdisciplinary collaboration. And this is a really famous diagram by Francis Bretherton. It's actually known as the Bretherton diagram. And he was trying to, it was the first diagram to sort of conceptualize what the Earth system might look like. And what you see in this diagram is an expansion from the physical climate system to now including biological processes, really conceived of in terms of biogeochemical cycles. There was this expansion from a physical perspective of climate to one that includes ecology and ecosystems. But the thing I'd actually ask is, to me, it illustrates a problem that climate scientists have always had of where do terrestrial ecosystems fit into the Earth system? Because you see ecosystems are showing up here under biogeochemical cycles, they're not showing up on the physical climate system at all, and they're not actually considered part of terrestrial energy and moisture fluxes. So there's this separation of where terrestrial ecosystems fit into, and it's always been conceived of in terms of biogeochemical cycles, not in terms of the physical system. Well, we can still see that today. This is a diagram of our Earth system model at NCAR. It's the way we visualize and communicate what the model's involved with. And you see these component models that communicate with one another through what's called a coupler. And I think it's a very nice diagram to talk about sort of the different aspects of the model. And it basically says, you know, if you're an atmosphere person, you're going to be in this box here. If you're an ocean sea ice person, you're going to be over in this box. What it doesn't do a good job is explaining the connections between these different component models. What about the sea ice really matters for the atmosphere, for example? And so in this respect, you can argue that this type of diagram is more multidisciplinary than it is really interdisciplinary. And we can see that even further if we focus in on the land side, because again, you see this problem of where does biogeochemistry fit into? And land actually has this separate box of biogeochemistry. So if you're a biogeochemist, you're actually in this box here, sort of separate from the land. And so what we need to do is we really need to find ways of talking about the interdisciplinary aspects of the science rather than the disciplinary components. And what I tend to focus in on myself and what I prefer is looking at processes rather than disciplines. And this is my way of sort of conceptualizing and explaining how we went from the physical climate system in the 1990s to the Earth system perspective that we have today. And you can see it's talking about processes of photosynthesis, autotrophic respiration, heterotrophic respiration, reactive nitrogen in the system, aerosols, including smoke, dust, and BVOCs, land use and land cover change, including agricultural systems and deforestation and afforestation. So it's really process focused rather than disciplinary focused. And the final slide I want to have is just that this is a workshop hosted by NCAR, and we have a code of conduct. And the code of conduct really is ideas about offer constructive feedback, share the air, don't hog all the conversation, allow other people to speak, acknowledge teamwork, encourage innovation, show appreciation, consider new ideas. What I would argue is that these are very important concepts, not only for this workshop, for how we interact during the workshop, but I would argue that most of the challenges about ecology and atmospheric science and how they relate together is one of communication and the inability to communicate effectively across these disciplines. So let's, as we explore that idea and think about how to communicate better with one another, let's follow the NCAR code of conduct here and make sure that we're keeping up with ideas of collaborative and constructive comments. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I think we're getting close to 10:25, so maybe we should just go straight into that.
Yeah, Gordon, thank you so much for the great introduction. And it's, 10:26, so we can just go ahead and move into the next set of presentations. And so next up is Predicting Life in the Earth System, Linking Ecological Observations with Modeling Tools by Danica Lombardozzi and Dave Durden. And just to introduce both of them, if you don't know them, Danica Lombardozzi is a project scientist in the Climate and Global Dynamics Lab at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. She received her PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology at Cornell. And Danica's research focuses on how terrestrial ecosystems are changing in response to human activities and the impact that these changes have on climate. And Dave Durden, who will be co-presenting with Danica, is a surface atmosphere exchange data scientist in the Terrestrial Instrument Systems team at the National Ecological Observatory Networks in NEON. He performed his graduate studies in the Lab for Environmental and Atmospheric Physics at the University of Georgia. And Dave's interests include spatio-temporal scaling of fluxes, data model integration, and unmanned aerial system data and sample collection. And as Gordon mentioned before, both Dave and Danica have been helping organize as they're new members of the steering committee here and are also working on this other project linking NEON and NCAR that we have going. And we're going to allocate about 20 minutes for each presentation. And so if we have time for questions, I'll ask that you put them in the chat and I can select some to read. And we'll get to that at the end of their talk. And with that, I'll turn it over to them. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. So, yeah, I'm David Durden. Today I'll be talking about predicting life in the Earth system and how we are planning to link ecological observations with modeling tools. And as Gordon and Mike were talking about, this project was kind of born out of the first workshop where Danica, Lombardozzi, and Will Weeder and myself began trying to format some neon data for ingestion into CLM. And then as that progressed, we were able to get a pilot study funded through a partnership of Geo, Bio, and SciSce directorates, where we were able to kind of extend the workflow that we originally created and brought on some additional collaborators such as Negan Sabani, Brian Dobbins, Jim Edwards, Samantha Weintraub, and Don Lenz. And so this work has kind of began with the idea of just integrating neon ecological observations with the NCAR Earth system models. And we felt that this integration could enable exciting scientific discoveries, such as predicting changes in terrestrial processes, expanding measurements to regional and global scales through scaling with the models, and potentially disentangling complex ecological interactions that could potentially back inform the models and the processes therein. So the initial project is looking at simulating neon flux towers. And to do that, we developed a simple containerized cloud-based simulation system where we ingest process neon data, such as the meteorological inputs, site characteristics, and then some additional data for model evaluation. It's processed in this Dockerized CLM simulation model, where we can predict the ecosystem states and fluxes. And then we've provided some additional tools for analysis for model evaluation and potentially looking to extend into forecast in the future. And we hope that this will help lead to new scientific discoveries and iteration. The first portion of this study was acquiring and just formatting the data for CLM. A lot of the data on the Neon data portal required gap filling and kind of getting into the appropriate format for ingestion in CLM. So that started with the meteorological inputs. And we're using the new 2021 Neon data release data for that, applying a gap filling workflow. And currently we have data available from 31 sites. We've processed all 47 Neon terrestrial sites, but some of the sites still have some longer gaps that we're working on creating a refined approach to fill those gaps. So additionally, we're providing site characterization data, such as soil characteristics by depth, looking at bulk density, soil texture, and et cetera. And we've began looking at ways that we can parameterize with modeled vegetation traits. So we have some ideas underway for that as well. And then we have some exciting initial model validation scripts that are put together that allow evaluation interactively in a bulky dashboard. And additionally, we just were able to get out an NCAR Neon prototype dataset yesterday, actually. So a lot of exciting things happening. So from the Neon side, how does that workflow look? So initially, we take data from the Neon API using tools that we've put together on GitHub and Dockerized to perform some QA/QC and some gap filling, and then formatting that data into NetCDF and applying the appropriate metadata, such as UD units and some schema.org metadata to make sure that it's discoverable. And then that data is written out to S3 buckets where it can be grabbed from by NCAR to be ingested in CLM. And additionally, we've also been working together with people from the Rubisco project and Pecan to try to extend the capabilities of these files and the ecological forecasting initiative to ensure that these data files are used as broadly as we can. So since that initial inception of the workflow, there's been various improvements, such as an improved gap filling technique using redundant data streams, where we're able to reduce uncertainty and bias in the meteorological inputs through using a flexible decision framework and redundant or related data streams at NEON sites. This is pretty exciting because I think this will also be able to extend the NEON Ameriflux pipeline and allow us to provide more robust data products to Ameriflux in the long run. Additionally, we now are providing the site characterization data from the soil pits that were performed at the beginning of construction at NEON sites. And we've taken the workflow and Dockerized it and ensured that it's portable across platforms. And the data are now easily accessible in S3. So through performing this study, we've been able to identify some data quality improvements that can be made at NEON. So for instance, through testing relationships between the redundant and related data streams while gap filling has allowed us to identify issues where maybe a calibration was entered incorrectly into the NEON system. Or for instance, one that we caught was that atmospheric pressure was being mapped incorrectly into the surface atmosphere exchange data files. And so we were able to correct that and get the appropriate data on the portal. Additionally, as mentioned, we're hoping that this gap filling workflow will be expanded and through a collaboration with Ameriflux and developments with the OneFlux processing suite. And here on the left, you can kind of see just how the related regressions allow us to kind of determine if maybe we have some inappropriate coefficients during a certain time. And here on the right, we can kind of see how the data are gap filled using different techniques, whether it's from a redundant data stream or through one of the MDS approaches available in the R80 processing suite. So additionally, I wanted to talk a little bit about the data availability and exploration that's available. So as Gordon mentioned, we now have the NCAR NEON community collaborations page up. With the link here, you can, on that page, we also have some snapshots of the bokeh data exploration, which Danica will talk a little bit more about. But I also wanted to mention that as of yesterday, we also have an example prototype data set available on the NEON prototype data portal, which allows you to access this data through the NEON data portal and also through the API to the prototype data sets. And all these data are adhering to FAIR data principles. And lastly, for those that are interested in getting to the data sooner, there's also availability to grab the data directly from the S3 buckets. And here you can see that you can get a full bucket listing of what's available, from the atmospheric data forcing files to the site characterization data to the data that's coming back from NCAR. So yeah, feel free to explore that. And with that, I'll pass it off to Danica.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, so I just wanted to follow up on the data that's available through NEON and explain some of the tools that we've been developing at NCAR, which I think, I hope are really exciting tools that can help foster the interdisciplinary collaboration that Gordon is talking about. And I also want to highlight that immediately after this, I believe Emily Kyker-Snowman is going to talk about the process of incorporating new ecological processes into models. And so it links very nicely to connecting all of these different pieces together. So I'll just start by highlighting the community land model, which I really want to emphasize is a community-based process model. And I want to emphasize the community aspect of it because really it's at NCAR, we host the model and we work on developing and maintaining it, but we have a ton of external collaborators who really help us develop and use this model. what the community land model does is it simulates many ecological processes as they're related to energy, surface energy fluxes, hydrology, and biogeochemical cycles. So I'm not going to go into detail about the model itself, but there is a lot of information in publications and also documented online through some of the NCAR's websites, GitHub. We have technical documentation and a user's guide for this particular model. Next slide, Dave. Thanks. So one of the,
Danica, you're muted.
Danica, you muted there for a second.
okay, I don't know what happened. I did not mute myself, but okay. So one of the exciting new capabilities that we're developing is the capability to run CLM or community land model simulations of neon flux tower sites that you can run on your laptop. And to do this, we need to use a containerized model system. A container is just a pre-configured portable application that can reliably run on any computing infrastructure. So it means that anything that you need to run this model, any of the code, any of the files, that's all contained in what you will, well, it's contained in the container. So you download all of that stuff and it can run on any system then. We have a tutorial, it's coming soon. We are just starting to test this. And I would like to highlight, we are looking for initial testers. And so I'll link to the form at the end. And we'll posted that into the form, the link to the form in the chat if you want to sign up to help us test the system and provide some feedback. And so in this tutorial, you'll learn to run the container system, run a CLM simulation at a neon flux tower of your choice, and to visualize and evaluate the model data. Next slide. Okay, so the process of simulating neon flux towers in CLM, what we're doing is we're using the data that Dave just highlighted from NEON. And so we use tower meteorology. So these are variables like temperature, precipitation, pressure, humidity, and wind speed. We update the model to use vegetation characteristics from the NEON site. So we look at changing the dominant plant species to represent, or for CLM to represent the dominant plant species correctly if it wasn't already. And then we also add soil characteristics with the site from the megapits, like Dave was saying. This includes soil depth, sand and clay fractions, organic content. And then there's also fluxes available for model evaluation from NEON. So these are things like latent and sensible heat flux, GPP, net ecosystem exchange, net radiation. There are I think just over 30 NEON towers that we have process data that we know are running in this CLM framework. So that's exciting that we can run 30 towers, and the rest of the towers we hope are coming soon. We just have some minor issues that we're still working through with those particular towers. Next slide. So I want to emphasize something that probably many of you realize, but I just think it's worth mentioning, is that models approximate ecosystem properties. We don't expect them to be perfect. They're not exact replicas of ecosystem processes. And so, for example, a lot of the data that I will be showing you from here on out is for the Abbey Road site. And so I just want to highlight here, if we look at the Abbey Road site, this is a photo that I borrowed from the NEON website. And the Abbey Road site vegetation description says, Douglas fir and western hemlock are the upper canopy. We have pockets of red alder and mixed forest. There are logged areas. There's also western red cedar. So there's a lot of variability. In CLM, we represent this as a single plant functional type, temperate needle leaf evergreen tree. And so, so these are approximate representations. We can't capture all of the ecological complexity, but these generalizations that we have to make to represent processes are usually a pretty reasonable approximation. And I'll just highlight also that CLM really does use a trait-based approach because we do take traits for this temperate needle-leaf evergreen tree. There are specific traits that are associated with evergreen trees. Okay, next slide. So I'll highlight some results next. So this includes latent heat fluxes at Abbey Road. And so what you'll see on the y-axis is the latent heat flux. And this is just for 2018, which is the first year of available data at the NEON Tower. And this is an annual cycle. So you start in January, end in December. So the bars are the CLM latent heat flux, and the line is the NEON Tower observations. So what you'll notice is that CLM does represent the monthly average latent heat flux values. There's probably there is some underestimation in parts of the summer, maybe some overestimation of latent heat fluxes in the fall, but it's within the ballpark. And I didn't include any of the variability here because what I want to show you next is one of the, I think, exciting capabilities that a model like CLM can add to NEON data. So if you go next, and that is that we can partition the latent heat flux into the different properties. And so that's part of the reason why the CLM fluxes are represented in bars here. So the blue is canopy evaporation, the orange is canopy transpiration, and the green is ground evaporation. And the three of these sum to total latent heat flux from the system. But what you can see here in this partitioning is that at the Abbey Road site, transpiration dominates the latent heat fluxes in the summer, the spring, summer, and even fall months. But then as you get into winter, there's a lot more canopy evaporation that is dominating this process. Ground evaporation is also important, but I should highlight that Abbey Road is in the Pacific Northwest. And so I think that there's a lot of foggy weather, especially in the winter. So that would be my guess as to why canopy evaporation is dominating some of those winter months. Next slide, please. So another thing that I wanted to look at was gross primary productivity. And so these are, this black line represents the NEON data available for gross primary productivity. You can see that there's a little bit of a peak in the summer, but there are several months of missing data at this particular site. So if you go to the next slide, so when we overlay CLM simulations, the simulations can help fill some of these data gaps. And you'll notice that CLM simulations fall within the range of variability for the NEON data in available months. So January and February, June and July, and then October through December. CLM matches those observations relatively well. Perhaps the variability is a little smaller in CLM than it is at the NEON site. But given that the CLM predicts NEON GPP relatively well, I think that we could probably, I would argue that we could use CLM data to fill in those data gaps and have a better understanding of what GPP might be during those times when GPP data aren't available from NEON. Okay, so next slide. The last thing that I want to show you is just this interactive plotting interface that is available on the NEON website. So this is really exciting. And so again, this is latent heat flux. These are daily latent heat flux values for, again, for 2018. And so this is really cool. I just took a screenshot, so I can't show you, but it's all interactive. So you can go in and you can start zooming in on the plot. There will be capabilities to look at different variables and different sites. And so you have this time series on the left, and then you have the regression between CLM and NEON on the right with a lot of the statistical summary. So if you wanted to not run any of these simulations and just look at NEON data and CLM data, you can go to this website and just poke around. Okay, next. So just last, the CLM model data will be available through this NEON prototype data portal and also NEON's S3 bucket, as Dave mentioned earlier. And this includes ecosystem fluxes and ecosystem states. A lot of carbon fluxes and water fluxes will be available, as well as things like soil carbon, soil moisture, snow depths. And all these data will be updated monthly and available through that NEON website. So last, so I just want to end here with emphasizing that this is a really, really neat new tool, and it's been a really fun collaboration to work on. I think this collaboration is improving both the data and the models. And so we're excited for everybody to get to start using these tools. And if you're interested in being an early adopter and sharing your feedback with us, please fill out this form. We're hoping to have some of that information or that everything to you by mid-October. So if you fill out that form, you'll hear from us again in the near future. And yeah, so I just want to say thank you and stay tuned for Emily's talk on incorporating new ecological processes into models like CLM.
Thanks so much, Danica and Dave. That was great. We have maybe 1 minute for a really quick question. So I'm just going to start back at the first one, which is how near to real time are these gap-filled data available, Dave or Danica? Which was the first question. And then maybe we can, after the workshop, we'll gather the other questions that we don't have time to answer verbally, and we can answer them later for people and post them to the folder.
Yep. So currently the gap-filled products are through July of 2021. The idea is to create a rolling processing eventually that would allow us to stay around a month at a month latency for the gap-filled products.
Great. Thanks so much, Dave. Okay. So yeah, we're right about perfect time to move on. So next up is going to be Emily Kyker-Snowman, and she's going to be speaking about increasing the spatial and temporal impact of ecological research, a roadmap for integrating a novel terrestrial process into an Earth system model. And Emily, most importantly, perhaps recently graduated with her PhD in soil biogeochemical modeling from the University of New Hampshire. So congratulations to Emily. Her dissertation included working on the mimics model of soil carbon and nitrogen cycling with members of the CLM model team at NCAR. And also, this is important, she asked me to add that she's currently looking for a job. So if you know of any openings in terrestrial biogeochemistry and you like her talk, which I'm sure you will, please let her know. And with that, I will turn it over to Emily. Thanks so much, Emily.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for having me today. Really excited to talk to you all about this paper that was recently accepted at Global Change Biology. So keep an eye out for it in the next month or so. I'm new to this NCAR NEON collaboration, so I should say I hope that some of what's in here is helpful for facilitating some interesting conversations with this group. A little bit of background on this paper. This paper was born originally out of a USDA grant that was focused on reducing decadal scale uncertainty in Earth system models by incorporating more ecology into Earth system models. So the team that worked on it was made up of representatives from the community land model at NCAR and ecologists from all over the country. And it was a really cool project to be a part of, a really interesting and productive collaboration. But one of the things that we learned as a group as we worked through some of these, adding processes to Earth system models is that it's really difficult to do this work without a shared lexicon and without a shared understanding of the steps involved in integrating a new process into an Earth system model. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be talking a little bit about how we build up from sort of smaller scale models, integrating those into ecosystem scale models, and eventually finally build into the scale of an Earth system model. And I think that's really relevant, hopefully, to today's workshop, because Earth system models are one of the ways that we connect ecology and atmospheric sciences. So in the community Earth system model, and Gordon already spoke a little bit about this figure and some of the issues with it and the way that it divides things along disciplinary bounds. But typically in an Earth system model, you have a land component, which is where you're going to find most of the ecological processes that are incorporated. And you have an atmospheric component, and then you have a coupler that connects between those things and describes the feedbacks between those land and atmospheric components. It's important to note, and this is, Gordon spoke a little bit about this, and I know two of the working groups are going to be thinking about this a great deal, but important to note that when we're talking about the integration of ecology into Earth system models, that's a relatively new science. So a lot of Earth system models originated in atmospheric and physical science communities, and terrestrial vegetation and representations of terrestrial ecology really only show up in the last 20 years or so of working with Earth system models and land surface modeling. So this is a really nice figure from a recent paper that talks about the history of land surface modeling and over time, how different types of processes and representations of components of the Earth system were added. And I would argue, looking at the different types of things that were added over time, that ecology really only shows up when you start to see dynamic vegetation and the carbon cycle and nutrient cycle show up. And I just want to drive this point home, because when we're talking about integrating ecology into Earth system models, it's important to remember that we haven't been doing it for very long, and we're still figuring out how to do it well. But ecology is starting to work its way into Earth system models. So this is the diagram of CLM version 5, and it just shows you some of the different ways that terrestrial vegetation in particular mediates biogeochemical cycles, hydrologic cycles, and surface energy fluxes. And in addition to sort of the terrestrial vegetation impacts on these processes, there's also a push to integrate different types of ecology into these large-scale models. So one example of that is near and dear to my heart, because it's what my dissertation focused on, are below-ground processes. So in general, in Earth system models, soil decomposition is represented implicitly using decomposition constants. It's represented in a very simple way, when in reality, we know that soil decomposition is a complex process that's controlled by diverse microbial communities that respond in really different ways to climate and environmental drivers, things like warming, or as you see in this diagram, CO2 fertilization impacts on plant inputs to soil. So there's this growing awareness that ecology and Earth system modelers have a lot to gain by working with one another. Ecologists are aware that Earth system models are a really critical tool in understanding the changing climate and understanding the relationship between ecological processes and climate feedbacks. And Earth system modelers are aware that ecology controls many of the feedbacks between terrestrial processes in the atmosphere. So there's this general awareness that Earth system models should include more ecology, that we should strive towards that. And it's become really commonplace in ecology papers to end with a refrain kind of like this, that either models should include the process that's described in the papers, or that the data that's collected in the paper should be used to improve models. But the process for doing that can feel pretty obscure sometimes. And my background primarily is as an ecologist, and it can be really difficult to break into modeling and to start to work with modeling, to work new processes into large scale models. So my team and I, as we were working on the synthesis paper, we came to understand that there's sort of this perception of how this process works, that empiricists who are gathering data feel like they're just sort of shoving data into a pipeline, and then inside this magic mystery box, there's a modeler who interprets the data and parses it up into something that a model can use. And my team and I would really like to shift that paradigm away from this real split along disciplinary bounds between empiricists and modelers, and into a paradigm in which empiricists and modelers are working together at every stage of the process. So for example, in early data acquisition phases, that's obviously going to be driven more by an empiricist, but even at that stage, the modeler is involved in saying, could you please measure this, or could you please pay attention to these drivers that I think are going to be important later on when we start to quantify those processes. And then in the middle stages, empiricists and modelers are working together to translate ecological concepts into the language of matter and energy that models use. They're working together to quantify processes and reduce them down to a form that models can use. And then finally, even at this late stage of integrating a new process into an Earth system model, even though that's going to be primarily driven by a modeler, the empiricist is still involved in making sure that the way that new process is integrated into the larger framework of an Earth system model, making sure that that's faithful to the understanding of how that process works on the ground. So everywhere throughout this process, the empiricist and the modeler are working together to make the process work. And so my team and I developed this flowchart sort of as a guide to understanding the steps along the way of integrating a new process into an Earth system model. And our goal with this, our goal with this flowchart is to make this pathway accessible to anyone, to make it so that anyone, regardless of their skills with programming, could see themselves in this process and could take a novel ecological concept and make a to-do list for how to get that into an Earth system model. Importantly, I want to emphasize that there's sort of this broad illusion that this process works by taking data and putting it through a modeling process of some kind and then developing insights out the other side. And in fact, there are lots of different steps in the procedure for getting a new process into an Earth system model. And every single one of those steps has different data requirements shown here in white boxes and different insights that are developed on the other side shown here in tan boxes. So when we talk about getting data into models and data model integration, that can happen in a lot of different ways and a lot of different processes along. It's not one thing, it's many different things. So I'm going to walk through each of these sort of large phases of this flow chart now and talk a little bit about specific examples that I think illustrate processes that are sort of stuck in each one of these phases. And I hope as I'm talking about it, I have specific examples in mind that are relevant to my work, but I hope that you'll think about this in terms of your own interest, your own ecological processes that you might want to work into an Earth system model. And if we have time for questions at the end, I'd be happy to talk a little bit about how to apply this to your own thinking, your own work. So this first phase of the, excuse me. There we go. This first phase of the flow chart is meant to be a suite of thought experiment questions that anyone can answer without having to do any programming at all to assess whether or not a process is even ready to start modeling quantitatively. And the example that I'm going to use to talk about this is locust swarms. Insect herbivory in general and locust swarms specifically are something that ecologists know have a large impact on the ecosystems that encounter them. So we know that locust swarms, have large impacts on the loss of vegetation, the loss of, green cover, and that has long-term, excuse me, that can have long-term feedbacks with climate through all the different ways that vegetation and climate interact. So I'm going to start here sort of from the bottom of these questions and walk through how each of these questions apply. So thinking about if you were a locust, thinking about how if you were a locust scientist, how you might try to integrate locusts into an Earth system model. So the first question, starting from the bottom, is the process likely to impact climate on scales of time and space that are relevant to an Earth system model? And as I've just described, I would say yes. We know that they affect vegetation on large scales that are likely to be relevant within the context of an Earth system model. Is the process included in an Earth system model already? You'll have to take my word for it, or you could go through the documentation for any number of Earth system models and see that this is true. But to my knowledge, there are no Earth system models that include insect herbivory at all, let alone something like a locust swarm. But then this third question is really where this process gets stuck. Does the process behave consistently through space and time? And as many of you likely know, models are really built on repeatable patterns in the relationships between variables. So I would argue that in the case of locust swarms, we don't understand enough about what causes them to be a certain size or to travel to certain places. And so it's really difficult to reduce locust swarms down to a suite of equations that relates their impacts to variables like temperature and precipitation and phenology. So a locust scientist who is interested in working with Earth system models might focus on gathering more data that help to make the process more understandable through space and time, more consistently understandable through space and time. So then the next phase of this flowchart is really focused on simple models of individual processes and testing those simple models by themselves. And the example that I'm going to use in this case are microbially explicit models of soil carbon and nitrogen cycling, which is what my dissertation focused on. And the two steps involved in this phase of the flowchart are to build simple models and explore whether or not those explain observed patterns, and then to gather the data to quantify and drive those simple models at increasingly large scales. So in the case of the mimics model shown here, when the model was initially built, it was initially built just for carbon, and it was evaluated using litter decomposition data sets at just a handful of sites. And then eventually it was evaluated across a continental gradient of sites that really give you, the full range of climate conditions. And then more recently, it's been used to simulate carbon and nitrogen in soils around the globe and to compare some of those simulations against global maps of soil carbon and nitrogen. So along the way to getting a process into an Earth system model, it's important to first quantify it and then to see how that process behaves by itself against, a range of different data types. And then finally, the last phase of this flowchart has to do with testing the process within an Earth system model. And even at this stage, there are multiple steps involved. So the first step, if you want to integrate a new process into an Earth system model, is to connect your simple model developed in the previous phase to all of the biogeochemical processes, biogeochemical cycles and processes that are already present in an Earth system model. So this is kind of like hooking up a set of speakers to a television, in that you need to, have your inputs plugged into the appropriate spots for the red plug and the white plug and all that. Or maybe you have a television that has an HDMI port and an old school set of speakers, and you need to get an adapter between the two. It's just important to translate between your simple model and the Earth system model and do the work of actually connecting those cycles together. After that's done, the next step is to scale that model process globally and evaluate its performance against multiple regions. And this is really, the strength of working with Earth system models, is that you can ask questions about how a process behaves globally. And then finally, the last phase is to compare new and existing approaches and assess how adding your new process affects changes in global simulations. So, I think in ecology, at least, there's sort of a common misconception that increased model complexity always reduces uncertainty. And in practice, that's often not true. Oftentimes, when we make models more complex, it can increase the uncertainty in those models. So it's important to maintain parsimony as Earth system models become more complicated, and ensure that the new processes that are being added are making the models perform better and do better at their objectives, including making the models better able to predict the future. So that's the entire flowchart, and that's sort of, I hope that this will generate some conversation within this group about this, this sort of proposed process for integrating new things within an Earth system model. I suspect that this procedure is different in atmospheric sciences than it is in ecology, but I hope that it will generate some questions and conversation throughout the course of today. And with that, I'll take questions.
Thank you so much, Emily. I'm looking in the chat. Does anyone have any questions they want to put into the chat? There's a lot of comments about it being really interesting and great framework, but I don't see any questions as of yet. So maybe we'll give it, we'll circle back and see if anyone has any more later at the end of the next talk, at the end of the session of talks. But thank you so much, Emily. That was great. And we will move on to the next talk, which is by Deborah Coen. And Deborah has been involved since the first workshop, and is going to be speaking today about when the Earth became a system, which is a cool title. I really like it. And Deborah is a professor of history and chair of the program in History of Science and Medicine at Yale University, where she is also a member of the steering committee of the Environmental Humanities program. Her research focuses on the history of the modern physical and earth sciences and the intellectual and cultural history of Central Europe. She is the author, most recently, of Climate in Motion, Science, Empire, and the Problem of Scale, and the Earthquake Observers, Disaster Science from Lisbon to Richter. And so with that, I will turn it on over to Deborah. Thank you so much, Deborah.
So I'm using a new device, so I'm going to need some feedback. Can you hear me and see my screen?
I can hear you and see your screen, yes.
Fantastic, okay. First, I would just want to say how happy I am to be part of this. That last presentation was fascinating. I'm just really excited to have this opportunity to interact with scientists. So let me start with the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society article that we were assigned for homework. It tells us that NEON was designed in the first decade of the 21st century to meet what the NRC called the grand challenges centered around detecting continental scale ecological change and forecasting its impacts. And this focus on the global scale and predictive modeling often seems to me to set the parameters for thinking about the relationship between ecology and atmospheric science today. The bias is clearly towards the methods of physical science. So it struck me, for instance, in reading that BAM's article, that when the authors want to illustrate NEON's capacity to encompass contrasting perspectives, both perspectives are actually drawn from mathematical physics, right? Lagrangian and Eulerian flow descriptions. So I realize that to many of you, it may seem self-evident that this NCAR-NEON collaboration is framed by the agenda of Earth system science, insofar as the Earth is a system that needs to be studied and observed and modeled as such. What I want to do now, though, is open up some new questions and possibilities. So this is not meant as critique, but to invite brainstorming. I want to question the self-evidence of Earth system science. As a historian, I want to consider Earth system science as itself a moment in history. So when scientists tell the history of Earth system science, this is an example from a recent article with the lead author, Will Steffen, they tend to make the history seem inevitable, right? ESS is portrayed as the logical outcome of a sequence of conceptual developments, ecosystem theory in the 1930s, global biogeochemistry in the 1940s, general systems theory in the 60s and 70s, complexity theory in the 80s and 90s, and then the recent advances of computing and remote sensing technologies. By contrast, I want to think about the historical contingency of Earth system science. By contingent, I mean something like what Stephen Jay Gould meant when he likened evolution to history in Wonderful Life. That is, I will argue first that Earth system science was just one among several ways in which interdisciplinary environmental research was framed in the 1980s. And second, that multiple earlier scientific traditions converged in Earth system science in ways that are not fully coherent. My hope is that by recognizing this contingency, interdisciplinary researchers like yourselves can be more deliberate about what you adopt of the values and norms of Earth system science, and ultimately find your ways towards the truly transformative science that this moment in the history of life on Earth demands. So the dominance of Earth system science was hardly a foregone conclusion circa 1980. Viable alternative conceptions of the Earth as an object for scientific study existed and would likely have led to quite different modes of interdisciplinary collaboration. So one example is NASA's proposal for a research program centered on the Earth's habitability, which, unlike Earth system science as originally formulated, would have included the social sciences. And this program, as the historian Jennifer Barden has recently shown, failed to win support not because of inherent intellectual shortcomings, but because NASA neglected to do the diplomatic work required to win buy-in from other countries. Another option was the idea of the Earth as a living organism, Gaia, a framework that might well have placed ecologists in a position of leadership over physical scientists, and which failed to win support for equally contingent reasons. Scientists were attracted to the theory's associations with New Age spiritualism, but perceived that association as a risk for their authority as experts. When practitioners of Earth system science today tell the history of their field, they often identify Gaia as a starting point, but I think that's misleading. Gaia was not a predecessor to Earth system science, but an alternative, a framework that could well have shaped a different mode of interdisciplinarity. Helpful for thinking about the historical contingency of Earth system science is the concept of geoepistemology, as formulated by the historian of science, Bill Rankin. As Rankin defines it, a geoepistemology is constituted by technologies and practices of producing spatial knowledge, and is a way of knowing that embeds the geopolitics of its era. So with this in mind, we might characterize the geoepistemology of Earth system science according to the following traits: its reliance on remote sensing to produce homogeneous global data, on computer modeling for making predictions at timescales deemed relevant to policymaking, in other words, on the order of decades. Further, by its exclusion of humanity from the Earth system, right, as in the Brotherton diagram that Gordon showed earlier, humans are among the forces that affect the Earth system, but are not affected by it, right? An absence that integrated assessment models and then socio-ecological systems models have sought to correct. So human interactions with the Earth figure in Earth system science as impacts of technological agency, a concept that I'll come back to, while the non-human elements of the system are resources for human use. Finally, the concept of geoepistemology directs our attention to embedded elements of the geopolitics of the era in which Earth system science originated, the late Cold War. So the science prioritized global scale modeling in a way that assumed that environmental problems are to be addressed through international governance. In other words, this is a way of knowing that gives agency to wealthy states. In the words of the science and technology studies scholar, Sheila Jasanoff, this leaves unanswered the question of whether, quote, those without the power to patrol the heavens, to map and perhaps to devastate the Earth can ever meaningfully participate, right? It raises the question, would another way of knowing perhaps better support the agency of small states and non-state actors? Now, historically, the geoepistemology of Earth system science can't be traced back to any singular act of creation. It has origins in various moments in the history of science, technology, and geopolitics, only some of which I sketched in the article that was shared, The Advent of Climate Science. Viewed historically, we can recognize the hybridity of Earth system science. Its multiple legacies do not necessarily add up to a coherent whole. To take some more recent examples than those in my article, the reliance on measures of material and energy flows derives from practices developed by combatant states during the First World War to track the availability and costs of military supplies. So this is recent research by the historian of science, Etienne Benson. And you have here some illustrations that I've taken from his wonderful book, Surroundings. So this managerial perspective values top-down control. And it sits uncomfortably with the values that have attached to a more recently developed tool of Earth system science, namely ground-based sensors. Here I'm drawing on the work of Jennifer Gabris. So ground-based sensors were vaunted in the 2000s as a tactic for the decentralization and democratization of science. That is, when sensors are used to record fluxes at neon towers, we have a clash between a type of measurement associated with top-down control and a device associated with distributed agency. I would say these are tensions latent in the kind of science that NCAR, NEON are engaging in, perhaps tensions that are palpable to you, but that come into clear focus through historical analysis. Now, in order to fully appreciate the historical contingency of Earth system science, we need to consider the context in which it rose to dominance. Circa 1980, a time of rising scientific concern over global warming and a scientist's first efforts to guide international policy. For some scientists at this time, the turn to policy meant prioritizing the participation of multiple actors and the incorporation of multiple ways of knowing. This is a trend that I examined in my recent article, A Brief History of Usable Climate Science. Circa 1980 was also a time when many looked to ecology to become a leader of a new interdisciplinary science, a more human and politically engaged science, as Niels Gutler has explored in his recent work. However, quite a different vision for the future was taking hold at NASA. At the time, with the Cold War waning, NASA faced heightened public scrutiny of its funding. The agency's response was to seek to identify peaceful uses of satellites. Its loss of the Landsat program to the private sector taught NASA an important lesson. It could only be sure of controlling programs that counted as basic research. So NASA seized on Earth system science as a program of basic research that would justify its Earth observing system in taxpayers' eyes. The agency's Earth System Sciences Committee, a group made up primarily of meteorologists, promoted remote sensing and computer modeling as vehicles of interdisciplinarity that would enable scientists from different fields to speak the same language by virtue of working with the same data. In practice, interdisciplinarity here meant conforming to the epistemic norms of atmospheric science and oceanography. And this is an argument that has been made by several historians recently. That orientation is reflected in the statement quoted here from a 1985 meeting of the ESSC at NCAR. Since 1985, as far as I can tell, this has been the dominant agenda for research on atmosphere-biosphere interactions. Nonetheless, not everyone fell in line behind Earth system science. I'm sure each of you have firsthand knowledge of examples of resistance to the paradigm of Earth system science, and those would be fascinating to discuss during the Q&A or in the breakout rooms. Here are some examples that historians have recently written about. Geologists and geophysicists insisted that the study of the Earth system should include attention to processes lasting thousands to millions of years, as well as observations of the planet's interior and upper atmosphere. Geomorphologists insisted that remote sensing could not replace fieldwork, nor could it ground a quantitative understanding of the processes shaping the Earth's surface. In ecology, influential scientists such as Bernard Saugier in France chose to integrate remote sensing data into their existing research programs. Others, like the American Herman Shugart, continued to prioritize research on the landscape scale. In the 1980s then, other ways of studying the Earth as a system remained possible. Now, today in my own discipline of history, the temptation to fall in line behind Earth system science is almost as strong as it is in the natural sciences, luring many historians to adopt the frame of the Anthropocene. Two historians are even members of the Anthropocene Working Group of the International Commission on Stratigraphy. In my view, however, and that of many of my colleagues, the geoepistemology of Earth system science has severe shortcomings for historical research. So in the remainder of my time, I want to use the discipline I know best, history, to illustrate why interdisciplinary collaborations might do well to maintain a critical distance from Earth system science. So one weakness of the geoepistemology of Earth system science is its reliance on forms of data more readily available for Europe and North America than for the rest of the world. The consequences of this bias for interdisciplinary research are well illustrated by the history of studies of drought in the Sahel region of Africa. In 1975, as the region was suffering from a prolonged dry spell, the MIT physicist Jules Charney proposed that the cause was deforestation. He explained that the removal of forests by increasing albedo could enhance the dryness of a desert region. Charney's argument lent support to the widespread assumption that desertification had resulted from West Africans' mismanagement of their own land, a claim that echoed 19th century justifications for colonization. Development experts mustered satellite data to argue that deforestation was accelerating under post-colonial regimes, implying that Africans were falling short at governing themselves. And most important for the concerns of this meeting, integrated assessment models built the purported relationship between population growth and deforestation into the models used to forecast future environmental conditions, including the impact of accumulating greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. However, from the mid-1980s, scientists were finding evidence that drier conditions in the Sahel were an effect of large-scale climatic shifts, not of local human actions, namely changes in ocean surface temperatures. What finally dispelled the myth of deforestation, though, were methods that had no home in Earth system science: ethnographic work with locals and critical rereadings of colonial era documents. Local farmers taught scientists that some traditional farming practices are favorable to the growth of forests. They taught scientists to recognize extant clusters of trees as evidence of the technological agency of African farmers, rather than as remnants of destroyed forests. One reviewer of this research remarked in 1999, "Who would have believed even 5 years ago that today we would be recognizing the skills, persistence, and sheer wisdom of land users previously derided as uneducated, fickle, and ignorant?" In short, Earth system science told one story about technological agency in North Africa, while ethnographic and critical archival methods told a very different one. The history of the Sahel is indeed global history, shaped by planetary scale forces, but its study has depended on collaborations across disciplines that look very different from the interdisciplinarity promoted by Earth system science. Here I would point, for instance, to the paper listed here by the atmospheric physicist Alessandra Giannini and her collaborators in environmental anthropology, who are using household surveys to study the impact of global warming on food supply in the region. Now, we can generalize this case to observe that the geoepistemology of Earth system science denies the technological agency of non-dominant actors. The geographer and critical race theorist Catherine McKittrick asks the crucial question: who counts as a geographic actor? The lens of Earth system science sees only dominant white populations as geographic actors, while portraying indigenous, enslaved, and colonized peoples as passive victims of the forces of nature. Earth system science is ill-equipped in particular to recognize the historical technological agency of enslaved Africans. The philosopher Edouard Glissant describes the enslaved African as a stripped migrant who could not bring his tools, the images of his gods, his daily implements. In fact, the erasure of subaltern lives from the natural archives of Earth system science repeats the erasure of subaltern lives from historical archives. Making visible the technological agency of the subaltern requires methods such as critical race theory, historical archaeology, the history of material culture, and ethnography. As McKittrick writes, Black geographies attend to places, experiences, and resistances that are invisible to geography's traditional disciplinary lens. Spaces such as the Middle Passage, the plantation, the slave ship, the prison, the regions of the underdeveloped and global South, the underground, the elsewhere, the nowhere, the out there, the invisible. To take some examples of recovering the technological agency of non-dominant actors, archaeological research by Shadrach Cherukuri has revealed the history of innovation associated with what he identifies as metallurgical laboratories in many parts of pre-colonial Africa. The archaeologist Kathleen Morrison uses archaeology to transform our understanding of past human relationships to land in Asia and Africa. And finally, the historians of science, Lydia Barnett and Patrick Anthony, have both identified geology's and ecology's debts to the embodied knowledge of early modern miners. In Europe, a point that could be broadened to include enslaved miners in the New World. In short, what Earth system science misses, other methods of historical investigation have the power to reveal. Which is to say that the geoepistemology of Earth system science is not the only way to know the Earth, nor the only framework for interdisciplinary collaborations. To conclude, I want to invite you to ponder this provocative statement from the historian of science, Greg Nittman. And I hope to hear your reactions, if not in the Q&A, then perhaps in the breakout session or afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah. That was really fascinating. And I think Gordon has a question and I have a question as well. So Gordon, do you want to go ahead and ask yours? And then we'll see if others come up. I know I have one too.
Yeah, first of all, Debbie, thanks. That was a great talk. I learned so much from your presentations and your books and your writings. I think when we talk about interdisciplinary, it's not just sort of between the physical and biological sciences. It's also how we bring history and historians into this. And thank you so much for attending the first workshop and this one. A second point I want to make out is a point you mentioned Hank Schugert. There are three of us actually at NCAR who Hank Schugert was our PhD advisor. Me, Jackie Schumann, and Adriana Foster were all graduates, students of Hank at the University of Virginia. So it was really fun to see him mentioned in your ideas on Earth system science and alternatives. But my specific question relates to desertification in the work of Charney, because I agree, I have trouble. I think this is a troubling area, because I agree that the idea of Charney's hypothesis of why desertification was happening and the explanation was wrong. But he also exposed this idea of feedbacks between the vegetation and the atmosphere of albedo, evapotranspiration, clouds, and precipitation. And that idea actually is right, but the idea that it explained desertification is wrong. And I think this relates to this whole history of deforesting and reforesting the world. The idea that this was actually really having big impacts on climate at the time was wrong, but the process knowledge that was discovered of that is right. So how do we strike this balance between there's wrong stuff being said and there's maybe overgeneralization, but there were some of the specifics that were actually right. And so what's your perspective on that?
Sure, yeah. Right, the problem with Charney's intervention is not that the process was incorrect, but that the premise was incorrect. The premise of deforestation was wrong, right? Charney himself was buying into this myth that had long supported colonialism in Africa, right? The myth that Africans didn't know how to manage their own land. People just assumed deforestation was happening without having the methods to understand land management practices on the ground. So this is really not about Charney's theory. This is about the whole mindset that he was part of in the 1970s.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, and I think it's sort of what I worry about sometimes is in clarifying these issues, which is important to do. Sort of that point that you just made can get lost, and it's sort of my view on sort of this history of deforestation and climate change is in talking about that. The subtler points about the processes have held up and are things we're still actually trying to solve today. And what's missed is that processes. So I think how we communicate this is really important. And I think you do a great job at that as a historian. You're trained in how to communicate these ideas. I think we as scientists can always work better to take these ideas and really how we communicate them, and the subtleties of some of the things we're talking about is something we can always work on.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gordon. Thanks, Deborah. I think I have one quick question too, which is I find your talks and reading these papers, the Kenneth Thompson one Gordon sent out and the chapter you put in as homework, as well as some other materials, really fascinating in the sense that there seems to be all these different perspectives and layers contributing to sort of these misalignments. And one of the things that I think is fascinating is, and I get the sense of in reading, is there's also this really pragmatic element, which is people are just having these discussions in different journals and different places, and they're almost just, and do you still think that's an issue today? And do you think that something as pragmatic is really pushing towards an interdisciplinary journal with like a targeted, thoughtful approach to solve, sort of hitting on some of these things and resolving these things and bringing these disciplines together would be useful? Or is that, I'm just curious at that like pragmatic element of this whole thing. It struck me in reading it, like, wow, sometimes it's just people are having similar discussions in different places.
Such a great question. I'm not sure that a journal is the right place to start because the politics of publication are so different from one discipline to another. Having just published in climatic change for the first time, it runs much more according to social science norms, actually, that are foreign to me. I'm in the humanities, let alone natural sciences. And so I think starting with, just what you all are doing with sequential conversations, right? Not a one-shot conference, but cultivating a community. I think that's the way to go.
Great. That's a good point. Yeah, continuing it on, not just a, yep. Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Well, thank you, Deborah. Thanks so much. And great, we should probably move on now to Adrian Rocha will be presenting next. And Adrian has been involved also since the first workshop and is really sort of going to be spearheading this manuscript that'll come out of today's workshop moving into the future. And Adrian is an associate professor of ecosystem ecology in the Department of Biological Sciences at University of Notre Dame. His research program is largely focused on Arctic ecosystem ecology and post-fire recovery of Arctic vegetation communities and carbon fluxes using a combination of modeling, remote sensing, and eddy covariance fluxes of carbon and energy. With a PhD in Earth System Science from UC Irvine, Adrian is strongly interested in developing research programs bridging atmospheric and ecological sciences. And today, Adrian's going to be, as I mentioned, giving sort of a perspective of where he sees a manuscript based on today's discussions heading and some guidance for us as we get ready to take a 30-ish minute break and then head into some breakout groups. And we will all convene back in here before we separate into our groups, but Adrian will set the stage for that. And I will turn it over to him now. Thanks so much. And thank you again, Deborah.
Thanks, Mike. Do I share my screen right now? Or do you have it?
You have it. You can share it.
Yeah, I can share. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yep, all set.
Okay, great. Wow, I have been so impressed with all the presentations so far. Like Mike said, my presentation is going to sort of take a more general approach. I'm going to talk less about the specifics and talk more about what the background, the goals, and the purpose of this workshop is. And this workshop really is about facilitating collaboration between ecologists and atmospheric scientists, developing ways we can do this, and really listening to each other and hearing different perspectives from these different fields so that we can come to a common language to not only transform the science, but push the science forward. So in today's presentation, I'm going to take a 30,000 feet point of view or our 200,000 mile point of view in this presentation. And this is a picture on the left. I like to show this picture on the first day I teach general ecology. This is a picture taken by William Anders from Apollo 8 in 1968, and it's famously called Spaceship Earth. And it really shows the uniqueness of the world that we live in. This is the only planet that has organisms that we know of living on it. And these organisms play a really important role in how the Earth functions as a whole. So what's the problem? So humanity is causing climate change, and this climate change is having impacts on the biological systems that are known to be important components of the Earth system. These ecosystems and organisms not only create interactions that can influence climate, but they can also induce important feedbacks that limit our ability to predict what the climate will look like in the future. So here's a graphic sort of showing some of these land atmosphere feedbacks that you are probably already familiar with, but the important ones being carbon release from soils, permafrost melting, the biogeochemistry of the biology that goes on in the biosphere, and how that is influencing future climate through increasing CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. And all these different processes have interactions and feedbacks that can sort of really influence what the climate state is going to be in the future. So there's really an increasing need to understand these land atmosphere interactions and feedbacks, and really from an ecological, both ecological and atmospheric science perspective. And so here I got the quote from Donald Rumsfeld, which is really, I think, relevant in this case here. We have known knowns and unknown unknowns. So it's really our job to really figure out what's going on and constrain our understanding of these processes, not only at the process level, but also in order to improve our modeling of the Earth system. So where are we going? We are really living in a data renaissance period where there's lots and lots of observations of what soils are doing, what plants are doing, and how those processes are scaling up over time. And so one example of this is the NEON National Ecological Observatory Network, which is a networked observation of sites which standardize methods which can be used to monitor ecosystems. We also have satellites that are also monitoring the land surface, and we could start linking up these processes as they go from the very small scale to the ecosystem, to the region, and all the way up to the globe. So we really, the growth of these data sets has really grown exponentially over the past 20 and 30 years. And we're really at the frontier of using these data to inform models and understand ecosystems at scales that are unprecedented historically. And because we are at this frontier, we have to have developed new methods and technologies and statistical techniques to really synthesize and gather these data and develop an understanding. And one sort of fruitful avenue that we've taken, or road that we've taken, is through this ecological forecasting, where ecological data, atmospheric data, and models are combined together to not only inform the parameterization of these models and develop better forecasts, but also can be used to create a better understanding of how these land-atmosphere interactions interact with each other and feed into each other. So a lot of this work has been headed by Mike Dietz through the Ecological Forecasting Initiative. So I just want to say a quick shout out to Mike and thank him for his efforts in this area, because I think this is a really fruitful way of really combining these ecological data sets in ways to not only improve our forecasts of what the Earth is going to look like in the future, but also understand the underlying processes within ecosystems. But like with any frontier, you face some challenges and roadblocks. And so we as a committee have identified two types of roadblocks. We have data friction and process friction. And data friction we define here as issues that arise through differences in scale, representation, or challenges in attaining corresponding measures represented in models. So what we mean here is an example on the lower right-hand corner is, how do you really model a forest canopy? What sort of processes do you need to have? How is leaf photosynthesis scale up from the leaf to the ecosystem to the region? And this is really important to understand, because ecological systems are really known for the idea of emergent phenomenon. So where one process at one scale acts totally different when you observe that same process at a different scale. So this is really a big challenge for including data into models and sort of assessing what's the appropriate scale to use and how to transfer each process from one scale to another scale. And some of this Gordon has already touched upon. The second challenge or roadblock is this idea of process friction. And these are processes that are really important for these land-atmosphere interactions, but they're either poorly represented in models or not really completely understood. So there's the idea of locusts being poorly represented in Earth systems models. You could also add to that fire and the effect of fire on the recovery of vegetation and types of plant functional types that recover after fire, and their impact on climate. This is particularly important in the boreal forest, where post-fire recovery of either evergreen or deciduous vegetation can have huge impacts on the climate of the boreal region. A second example may be drought and teleconnections associated with drought and the ecosystem response to that drought. And these are all processes that are really complicated to understand, and they can really be better understood through an ecological perspective. But we need to make that jump from the ecology to representing the process in models, or understanding that process at a scale that is greater than an ecologist is likely familiar with or comfortable with. So the goal here for this workshop is really fourfold. The broad overarching goal is to really develop a dialogue and understanding between the ecologists and atmospheric scientists. So in this workshop, we have invited both atmospheric scientists and ecologists in an attempt to really understand where we're coming from, and also understand the biases that are inherent with the fields that we are working in. And hopefully work around those biases and perspectives to a common understanding, so that we can really start speaking a similar language in order to transform the science. And really, the goal here is to not really start from scratch. We really want to work from a basis of, standing on the shoulders of giants, as Ian says. We want to look to the past to see where we're going to go in the future. So a part of the themes of the working groups is to really understanding the history of ecology and atmospheric sciences, what types of collaborations between these two fields have occurred in the past, really identify what has made these collaborations successful. And then looking forward are the goals of points 3 and 4, really identifying current limitations in both the data sets, the processes, and the biases that each of these scientific fields bring to the table. Identify those in order to minimize this idea of data and process friction. And lastly, we want to really identify steps needed to move this field forward and produce transformative science. So Gordon pointed this out earlier, but I thought I would reiterate this. This is a guideline for our group discussion, best practices for effective group discussions. We really want to strive for an inclusive environment. The greater the participation, the greater potential for new insight. I know I've learned a lot from just keeping an open mind and listening to other perspectives. I think Deborah's presentation is a really nice example about how we can learn from completely different fields to gain a new perspective and insights into our own discipline. I would also like to emphasize that we should use the rules of improvisation. Tina Fey has some really nice rules. The comedian has nice rules about improvisation. Never say never when someone produces a new idea. Always say yes, yes, and. So try to build off of each other's ideas and sort of riff on that to sort of build a greater understanding. We will have moderators in each working group. So we encourage you to use the Zoom hand raising feature to make comments. And hopefully the moderators can sort of moderate that discussion so that everyone has a chance to participate. And really, this is the goal here for this workshop, is to have a lot of participation and a lot of input from different perspectives so that we can move forward. I'm going to really talk a little bit about the working groups next in the next 4 slides, what we should be doing, what should we be thinking about. Working group 1 is going to focus on the philosophy of ecology and atmospheric sciences. This is a historical perspective. We really want to understand what are the differences between these two fields. What are their goals? What methods and philosophical approaches do the different disciplines take to address these goals? And how do these approaches differ, and how do these differences impede or facilitate interdisciplinary collaborations? Group 2 is also taking this sort of historical perspective. And here, the important part is to really identify past successful collaborations between these two fields. And I think it's important in this case to really define what success means and what success looks like. But there are numerous examples of large-scale collaborations between these two fields that have been identified as being successful, and Gordon sort of mentioned one with the Boreas project. Once you identify these successful collaborations, think about what made these collaborations successful and transformative. Was it the new tools that they developed? Were there mechanisms that were applied that made interacting between these two fields easier? And then lastly, we want you to think about what were the novel technologies or methods that arose from these collaborations. The third working group, which is our largest working group, has sub-working groups associated with it, is on dealing with this idea of data and process friction. Figuring out what are the mechanisms creating this friction, and figuring out ways that we can reconcile this friction. So the first question is, what are the challenges for integrating data sets across the two disciplines? This is a data friction question. Second question is, what are some ecological processes that are important for, but largely excluded in atmospheric science and their models? So here we're sort of getting down to what are some of the process frictions that come from the ecological side. And then the last question are the dealing with the process friction on the atmospheric side. So what are some atmospheric processes that are important for, but largely excluded in ecological science and methods? So there's numerous examples of that. And I really want you to think about and discuss this. And I don't want to give you too many examples so I can tip the scale. So I want as much input as possible on this. And then lastly, the fourth working group is really a working group that is looking forward with respect to NEON, but not limited to NEON data sets. So the first question is, what factors are limiting future collaborations between atmospheric and ecological sciences? The second question deals with NEON data sets. So if you're really familiar with NEON data sets, this is the working group that you want to be a part of, and we need your input on. What NEON data sets facilitate collaborations between the two disciplines? What factors minimize their data process friction? The third question deals with underutilized data sets. NEON is collecting a bunch of data, not just eddy covariance data, which is probably the more commonly used data sets, but they have data on phenology, they have data on biodiversity. So I really want you to think about these underutilized data sets that NEON provides, and figure out factors that are maximizing their data process friction, and figure out ways that we can incorporate this information into our framework for dealing with land atmosphere interactions. And then lastly, this is a big, I want you to think big, and provided with unlimited funding, it would be great to get your feedback on what are the big ecological and atmospheric questions are that you would like to see addressed. So here we're thinking about transformative science and really pushing the field of land atmosphere interactions and feedbacks forward. So the outcomes and products, we've sort of discussed a little bit of this already, but I just want to reemphasize this. The outcome of this is pretty open-ended for now, but initially we really want to write a manuscript on this topic of facilitating collaboration between ecologists and atmospheric scientists. We want to provide sort of a framework of how this is done, what has limited this in the past, and how we can minimize those and address those challenges into the future. So we hope to submit a manuscript on this by spring or summer 2022. I'm going to really, after we finish our working groups, I will discuss what a more detailed timeline of what this manuscript looks like. But right now, for now, before we meet in the working groups, I really want you to focus on your input and the expertise that you are bringing to the table, because it's really your input that is going to determine next steps and possibly provide new directions for this manuscript. And then lastly, we probably will have for this manuscript data gathering and some type of synthesis that will be required to explore some of the ideas presented during this workshop. So this might be, analysis of the NEON data sets, or it might be a larger survey to the community on points or ideas that came out of these working groups. So I'll talk a little bit about in the next slides how this is organized. I think Mike will also discuss this, but I just want to introduce this. This is the Google, the shared Google folder online for this NEON workshop. You should have already signed up for a group. If you haven't, go to the Google Drive and find this worksheet, this Excel spreadsheet, group sign up and feedback, sign up for a group. I think we will have about 20 minutes after my presentation. If you want to switch groups, you're more than welcome to do that. So go to that folder and go to the Excel spreadsheet and sign up for a group if you haven't already, or change your group if you want to. This folder also has working group slides. So you'll be meeting in these groups, addressing the questions that are associated with your theme. There's 2 or 3 questions per theme, and filling out a shared PowerPoint presentation for each working group. So this is inside of this working group slide folder. You'll find these slides, PowerPoint slides for each working group. So WG1 is the first working group for theme 1. You could see that working group 3, which is theme 3, has 5 subgroups associated with it. And I think theme 4 also has a couple subgroups associated with it. And Mike will provide more information on what group and subgroup you're associated with. Once you open up these slides, you'll find the questions that are being asked for each working group. And right here, I want you really to just go crazy with it and just add as much information as possible in addressing these questions. In the end, what we're going to do is we're going to go through these slides and we're going to synthesize this information and really extract out what we find to be the common themes that emerge from our discussions. So again, I'm going to end here, and I want you to really think big, and the sky is the limit here, and just have a wonderful discussion with people that you might not otherwise talk to at a meeting. So with that, any questions I will be able to address.
Great, thank you so much, Adrian. That was excellent. And there is one question in the chat from Laura, which is, it would be really great to hear a bit more about the scope of ecology that is intended here. So do you have any thoughts on that or clarifications for her in your group?
So yeah, so like I said, I have my own thoughts, but I don't want to introduce that bias into the discussion. I want to keep things as open as possible. So I really want you to define what the scope of ecology here is. So I do have my own ideas, but I want to keep it as open-ended as possible.
Great. Okay. And with that, I'm just gonna thank you, Adrian, again, and thanks to everyone else for speaking. Those talks were highly complimentary and really exciting and interesting. And I love the way they fed off each other. That was great. And so we're gonna move to a 30-minute break. But before we do, just to review, I put the link for the folder in the chat. If anyone hasn't signed up, it's the first tab on the group sign up and feedback spreadsheet. Secondly, the working group leads. If you haven't checked to see if you are a lead, we discussed this during the steering committee meetings. There's a working group leads spreadsheet in there with a name. And if you're on the steering committee and you haven't checked to see if you're a lead, there's a good chance you might be leading a discussion and just figuring out which of the letters. So working group, 3A will correspond to a name, and you'll know which series of slides to fill out. Or also, if your name is Will Weeder or Adriana Foster and you're not in the steering committee, you're also on that list, so don't forget to check. And we're going to take a 30-minute break right now. I think Todd is going to practice shuffling everyone into their breakout rooms during this 30-minute break, but we all will reconvene really quick to go over the guidance for the breakouts, and then we'll have about an hour or so for the breakouts after the 30-minute break. And there's no report out today, so we're just going to have everyone fill out their slides, and then we're going to reconvene after the breakout from about 1:30 to 1:45 for a few closing words from Adrian on next steps and timelines with regard to the manuscript, and then a little more from myself and Gordon. And yeah, during you can go ahead and mute yourself and turn your camera off during this 30-minute break while we practice shuffling people into breakout rooms. And we'll see everyone back here in 30 minutes for the breakout. And thank you again to all the speakers and everyone else. See you soon.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
great. All right, so hopefully everyone enjoyed their breakout sessions and had some good thoughts and discussions. And I think we have about 15 minutes left. We're gonna wrap up now, and we're gonna let Adrian give us a little more information on the next steps and timelines with respect to the discussions we had in the breakout group and where we'll go from here, and authorship and contributing to a prospective manuscript that could come from here. And then we'll turn it over to Gordon for a quick closeout and some information about the next steps in the broader workshop series. And so with that, if Adrian's ready, I will turn it on over to him.
Okay, first of all, I just want to thank everyone for participating. I learned a lot just with the discussion. It was really a great discussion, and yeah, my brain is sort of filled with ideas now. So, so what do we do moving forward? Okay, so here's just a brief timeline. It's not set in stone or anything. This may change over time. I think I need to really sit down with a couple of people on the committee and look at everybody's slides and think about some emerging themes that have come out from these discussions. But here's a brief timeline of what I'm thinking for this manuscript. So, in a couple weeks through the end of October, I'll be sitting down, trying to synthesize this information, identify a target journal, and establish next steps. By November, December, we may gather further information, establish a team, outline the manuscript, and then start assigning writing and data analysis tasks. January, February, we'll have probably another short meeting just to touch base, meet with the co-authors, establish a rough draft, finalize making figures, and identify missing pieces. And March, April, I'm hoping to finalize the draft for submission in either May or June. Of course, this may change, but I think this is a good start. In terms of authorship, here I think is one mechanism to determine co-authorship on this paper. We have sort of three major tasks. To qualify as a co-author, it would be great if we could complete 2 of the 3 tasks below. So the first task is contribute to a manuscript formulation and participate in a majority of the meetings. Most of the people on this call have already qualified for this task, so you can write that off. The second task would involve either figure making, data gathering, or data analysis. We have to see what that looks like, which will take some time, but we can establish that in a couple of months. And then the third task is a writing task. Once we have developed this sort of rough outline of what we want the manuscript to look like, we can allocate writing assignments and tasks to different people, and they could work on that as a team or a subgroup, to establish that first draft. Let me see if this question is for me. No. Here is so how do you sign up if you're interested? This is the share folder. In the share folder, there's an Excel spreadsheet called authorship sign up. What it looks like is this. So if you could put your name, your email, your email, and then also the theme of interest that you're most interested in writing or developing further. So I think that's it from my side. Gordon?
Thanks, Adrian.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. And first, I want to thank everybody for taking what's now will be almost 4 hours out of a very busy day, particularly people at universities who have all the other commitments of teaching and advising and other things going on. I think we had some really good discussions in the breakout group that I was involved with. I think it took a while to break down sort of some barriers and get to know each other, but then when we did, we had some really fun conversations. So I want to thank everybody for their participation, but I also particularly want to thank the speakers, because Mike and I were sort of noticing, like, wow, these talks were all without really any coordination attempts beforehand. They were all very well integrated with one another. They actually complemented each other very nicely, and they all brought up really important points of what we're trying to talk about. And so I particularly, want to thank Danica and Dave for their work on the modeling, Emily for her perspective on what it was like to actually get involved with this, both as an ecologist and as modeler and as a graduate student. It's really going to be a very influential paper when everybody gets to see it. And then Deborah, her perspective on history is just so important to this. As I said earlier, we talk about interdisciplinary as physical and biological sciences, but there are other aspects of this that we need to be considering too, and just sort of the history and the historians have such a fun way of thinking that's so different than we do in science. And as Mike said, I've been struggling to figure out how do I describe what's going on with this. And Deborah just sort of had a great title, When the Earth Became a System. That's such a nice, succinct title to explain sort of what some of the things we're talking about. My titles tend to be more factual. That's just a brilliant title. And then Adrian, of course, for taking the wherewithal to really lead this manuscript perspective. There's a lot of effort that's gone into, that he's done in terms of putting this together to begin with. There'll be a whole lot more effort, going forward. So really, Adrian gets kudos for that. And then just sort of logistically, Mike, as I said, organized this whole thing. So let's thank Mike, and then Todd for his administrative support. I don't have much more to say other than there will be, we do want to have the second workshop focus on modeling, and we've nominally called that November. Mike and I were talking a couple of days ago, or emailing, I can't remember now, but we're actually sort of identified it already. It has to be an early November maybe like the first or second week of November is when we'd have to have that workshop. So we're going to have to get going pretty quickly on organizing that and finding out how we want to go forth with that. But think about something, if you can, in sort of early November, I think we actually even mentioned maybe like November 10th, that for some reason that day is sticking in my mind. But anyways, that's what you'll see next, in addition to all the follow-ups that you saw from Adrian about this particular, his manuscript that he's leading. Mike, do you have anything you would like to add in closing this out?
Just to say thank you again to all the speakers and to everyone for, like you said, taking time out of their busy day. And I think it's been a really fascinating workshop, and I look forward to continuing the collaborations with everyone who's here today. And we'll hopefully work with you again in the near future.